No, it's great to be in the Carnage house. I love a bit of Carnage.
We're going to talk about a few of the more specific things. Confucius Institute, One Belt, One Road and Trade.
Yep.
Some of this we covered last year, but the situation's gotten worse. So last year we found that there was some cancelling, I believe, in New South Wales public schools of the Confucius Institute programs. But now we find that Maurice Payne has ordered that Australian universities submit their Confucius Institute contracts for submission by June to see if they're in the national public interest. And then we had from Senator James Patterson, who's getting a Beta Male nomination of the week this week. He said his quote is that universities should carefully consider whether hosting an entity funded by a foreign authoritarian government engaged in serious human rights abuses for the purposes of promoting its soft power is something consistent with their values. So, what do we do about the Confucius Institute? What do we say about it?
Yeah, well, let's see, you've packed a lot of information in there, so I might just start talking. You pull me back on track if I drift off too much. First of all, in terms of lodging Confucius agreements with Canberra, look, if it's just about transparency, that's fine, right? No one's got a problem with transparency. The question is whether, after providing that transparency, the Foreign Minister then makes a decision to tear up the agreements, right? That's where the debate is. It's not about transparency. When it comes to Confucius Institutes, we're at a very interesting stage at the moment, because it's not clear what Maurice Payne, our Foreign Minister, is going to do. For example, we know just last week, I learned this, that Sydney University has actually renegotiated the contract with its Confucius Institute and its Chinese partner in a way that the Attorney General's Department says it's entirely happy with. So they see no reason now for Sydney University to register their Confucius Institute in terms of the foreign interference and transparency issues. So, it would be quite something if the Attorney General's Department says, we've got no concerns around foreign interference here anymore. We've had a look at it, it's all fine. But then you've got the Foreign Minister tearing it up because it's somehow contrary to the national interest. Well, if it's not about foreign interference, what is the national interest the line that's being crossed here? I think that'd be a tough one for Maurice Payne to explain. I mean, I've just got concerns about just this one person at a point in time defining what the national interest is. I thought we were a liberal democracy where your views and my views are all fed into the mix and that was all fine. But that's not the situation we're in now. We have a person in Canberra who can make a decision at a point in time to define, Team Australia. Again, this bloody Team Australia approach. Yeah, I know it may play well at the pub, but I think if you sat down after a few beers at the pub and you explained the problems with it, I think most people would get it. That this enforcing uniformity of views is not the Australian way. That's the bloody Chinese Communist Party's way.
Well, I couldn't be more in line with you there. And the Confucius Institute is one thing which I feel like I can actually speak on with some level of authority, given that I have been through it.
Right.
In that I was in a high school with a Chinese Confucius program. That's how I learned Chinese. And then through the Confucius Institute, I went to China on a one-semester scholarship to Fudan University. And what I found really interesting was that in the Confucius classroom where I studied Chinese in high school, it would have been the least political out of all of my subjects. I mean, you look at the English curriculum or the history curriculum, what they put in there. I mean, I think all of our speeches, for example, in the speeches unit in Year 12 English were all, intersectional feminist type of speeches. And I'm not here to, in this episode at least, give a critique of that, but there's zero political balance throughout the whole of the curriculum. I mean, I felt like when I got to Chinese, that was my break from the politics.
Right.
I actually wrote an article to SMH refuting an article that came out at the time about it. But I found there was actually zero political content taught. When I went to China, you'd expect them to be brainwashing about how good the CCP is, why Taiwan's part of China, why Hong Kong's part of China, why the South China Sea is part of China. I didn't get any of that, man. I got how to do characters and calligraphy and make dumplings, right?
Yeah. Useful skills.
It's just not true. And the people in the Confucius Institute classes that I know, will say exactly the same thing. But one more interesting point is that we talk about the national interest. I mean, when I went to a school that had 4 kids in Year 12 in my Chinese class, right? I was lucky I went to a private school, so that could be funded. Now, You go to a public school, do you know how hard it is to learn Chinese?
Yeah.
Like, there's hardly anyone
Yeah.
who will actually sign up to learn it. And then when they get to the higher stages of year 11 and 12 or even in university
Yeah.
or whatever, there's no other kids who'll do it. And so the school can't put the program on. And the Confucius Institutes, they're offering free money and free teachers to come over and train Australian kids how to learn Chinese, which is the most important language they could possibly learn.
Yeah.
And Australia's saying, no, you know, it's foreign interference laws. When at the same time, you've literally got hundreds of thousands of Chinese kids probably every year coming to Australian universities, and you don't hear complaints from them. I mean, there's probably the kids of the biggest leaders in China who all go to foreign universities or Ivy League schools or whatever. You don't hear them complaining about, you know, their kids being indoctrinated. And Australia were kicking up a huge fuss about it, and it's just not true.
So is it too early for me to jump in with a beta male nomination?
Yeah, you jump in with a beta male.
Well, you mentioned James Patterson before, talking about, you know,
I'll write it down.
the values challenge that China presents on our university campuses. So the obvious thing for James Patterson to do would be to stump up funding for language training in Australian universities, right? Is he? I must have missed it, Dougal, but I haven't seen him enthusiastically embracing increasing funding for Australian universities in language training, actually across the board. So it's a bit of a disingenuous position, if you ask me.
Yeah, surely having Australians who can speak Chinese is going to be immensely advantageous for Australia's future. Try doing business in China. It's one of the hardest things ever. And if you speak Chinese, it makes it a lot easier. So, James, you're going to get another touch-up back at the end of this podcast, if you're watching, which I know you are. Now, on to, this is going to be a long segment because we've got a lot of things to get through. One Belt, One Road. Now, Marise Payne, again, exercised her veto powers to terminate the One Belt, One Road agreement between Victoria and China. Now, you point out a lot that it's a memorandum of understanding. It's not binding. But people seem to be very happy. But a lot of people I talk to seem to be very happy because they think that we're part of some kind of global takeover bid by the Chinese government. What's your thoughts on the whole situation?
Yeah, people just love, sticking out their chest and puffing it up in front of China. You know, if you can give China a bit of a poke in the eye, all the better. So I was like, okay, well, what are you actually achieving? So we tore up this agreement, with a completely disingenuous line that it wasn't just about China. The only two other agreements that got tore up, one was struck with Syria. I think it was in the mid-1990s. It was just a joke.
Yeah,
right?
mine with Iran.
Yeah, woo! So it's all about China, completely. So yeah, it's non-legally binding. So it had no impact on the Victorian government's decision making, or it had no obligation for the Victorian government in terms of its decision making, let alone the national government. And the other thing is, Dougal, is there was just a simple, easy alternative. I think that's a point that I think is often missed. That agreement was due to expire in 2023, right? So everyone can see it's publicly available. Unlike the federal government's Belt and Road Agreement, by the way, which was signed in 2017, which they've never released. I mean, how ironic is that? The federal government has signed a deal.
Really? Did they sign one?
Yes, they did. Cooperating with China in third countries on Belt and Road projects. Just a quick aside, I was in Beijing in April 2019 when Frances Adamson, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Scott Morrison sent her over to Beijing to talk up. Australia was looking forward to engaging with China in the future on the Belt and Road Agreement. So what a joke. Anyway, so the Australian government could have told the Victorian government, look, come 2023, we're not going to let you extend that. So, just sort it out with China, right? And so it would have just been a very diplomatic, face-saving way. The federal government gets what it wants, but instead, the decision was made to blow it up and throw it in China's face. That's what happened. And, no one's explained to me how Australia's national interest is served by that approach.
Now, for people watching, the One Belt, One Road, like a fair amount of China's policy, as far as I can tell, it's a little bit fuzzy, right? Yeah. It's hard to actually see what it actually is. But from what we can tell, it's Chinese investment in infrastructure projects in other countries to encourage trade, right? It's supposed to be reflective of the Silk Road back in the day, a few thousand years ago. And one of the funny things I find is that it's literally one of the most productive things a country can do with their money is going and building good infrastructure in other countries. The one example I remember researching is this Friendship Bridge in, I think, Serbia, where it previously took people 50 minutes to get to work because they couldn't cross this bridge. Chinese funding comes in, they build this bridge, it takes 10 minutes,
Right.
Great for the economy. our foreign policy seems to have a lot to do with like encouraging other countries to adopt climate change policies and like diversity and things like that. I like the idea of building bridges instead. And then we still come back with this idea of, the main criticism of it is that it's debt trap diplomacy. And you dealt with that last time. I remember the quote was, "It's bollocks."
Yeah, I'm sticking with that, by the way.
There's been more academia on it suggesting that it's totally untrue and unfounded, but it continues to get parroted by people in the Australian government as well.
Yeah. And so, we talk about disinformation coming from China and Russia, and look, sure, let's have our eyes wide open to that. But what just terrifies me is when disinformation comes from within the Australian government or on the front page of Australian newspapers. What do you think is going to be more corrosive to our democracy? Some foreign ministry spokesperson in Beijing, engaged in wolf warrior diplomacy, saying some really nasty things about Australia, or something that's patently wrong but kind of sounds, possibly true on the front page of the Australian, or coming from Canberra. There's no comparison in my book, and yet we're more alarmed by the disinformation from overseas rather than from internally.
And there's one example which I believe I remember it correctly. It's like China had a massive investment into Philippines, like state power grid, for example.
Yep.
I believe they own a majority of Philippines, like electricity grid. And even though they're having a dispute in the South China Sea over territory, it's not like China's switched off the electricity, or at least I haven't seen any threats to do that. And like there's plenty of other examples of China investing in other countries, doing debt renegotiations, doing like interest loan freezes and things like that. And the debt trap diplomacy stuff seems to be patently untrue.
Yeah, well, I can't add anything more. I mean, the facts and evidence are clear on this, but it terrifies me that there's still people in the Australian government who have this. It's a narrative, right? It's a weaponised narrative that isn't based on any facts and evidence.
Now, you're by training an economist. And so I want to ask you a little bit about trade.
Sure.
Which also ties a bit into the One Belt, One Road. We've got the review of the Port of Darwin, which was which had a 99-year lease taken out by the Land Bridge Group, which is Chinese owned. That was in 2015. And so that's under review. Last time we even talked about some cattle stations that I think got reviewed, cattle station purchases. You said in a quote, what's at risk is new investment. We've seen numerous data sources that new Chinese investment flows into Australia have absolutely tanked.
Correct.
So where's Australia at in terms of, what do you think about Chinese ownership of Australian land? And can you clear up a little bit? This is sometimes, I think, a problem for people and for me as well. Is that every time a big Chinese company buys something, it's always a Chinese company with CCP links, right?
Yeah.
And that's presumably because basically every big company in China has CCP links. So what's your view of kind of Chinese ownership of Australian assets?
Look, I just want a rational discussion. So I'm all for, being clear-eyed about connections between Chinese companies. And if you're talking about a state-owned company, then obviously there's a direct connection with the Chinese government. But even private companies, there's going to be, you'll be able to identify links, right? But to me, that's not the main issue. To me, the main issue is what precisely are the threats that these companies present to Australia. That's a separate conversation, right? And I think we see that over and over again, where we just go off, in hyperventilation rather than rational thinking. For example, last year, if you want to stop a Chinese company from owning a telecommunications network, fair enough, okay. I think we can sort of all get a head around how that could potentially be a problem. But last year, we saw the Australian government block the sale of a dairy and drinks manufacturer that was owned by a Japanese company, and they stopped them selling it to a Chinese company. Now, well, I look at those, and I mentioned before how my position on the Morrison government has shifted a bit. It's those sorts of decisions that I just look at and just can't explain through any rational lens that leads me to be really worried. On Darwin Port, look, let's just stick with the facts, right? In 2015, the Secretary of Defence, the boss of ASIO, the head of the Australian Defence Forces, these aren't wussies on China, right? These are the people who are most concerned about China. They all ticked off on the deal and said it didn't involve a security threat. You had voices in Australia, such as Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, saying it was a risk for spying the Chinese could close the port to Australian access, people like Dennis Richardson, the Secretary of Defence, just laughed at those sorts of suggestions. So if we're going to tear up a commercial agreement, because that's what the Darwin Port deal is, then we really surely owe it to everyone, including ourselves, to be clear about what precisely are the risks. Now the story is, our geostrategic environment has become more threatening. Well, okay, so again, tell me, in Darwin, what is the problem? If we're about to have a war with China, can I suggest owning a bloody wharf in Darwin is probably not going to be the most vital strategic asset. We're going to need to build a military base, right? And there's nothing stopping us right now. Landbridge can own the wharf, and 50 kilometres west or wherever, let's build a military base. I mean, that's so this fixation we have with Darwin Port tells me that something else is at play here, and it's not Australia's national interest, and it's not serious security issues either.